To start, first of all, yeah, thank you very much for being here, and Happy New Year to every one of you. So welcome to the Deal Finder Corner. So this is your weekly property talk show brought to you by Property Filter, hosted by myself, Guillaume Black, your favorite Frenchman, a little bit out of breath today because running around somewhat. And the CEO and co-founder of Property Filter is the UK's highest rated platform to find deals, and we're on a mission to empower our property investor and deal sourcer members to find 1,000 deals this year, thanks to the Property Filter blueprint. And the purpose really with this Deal Finder Corner is to give you the best and the most recent and available resources in terms of inviting expert guests who will share with us the latest and most current strategies, tactics, and secrets about what actually works right now in terms of finding and making deals and the reality of systemizing and running a high-performance business in property. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to my good friend to this Deal Finder Corner, Adam Lawrence. So Adam is a very established property investor, having done 650 deals in the UK, from £23,000 flats up to a portfolio of 91 properties at any one time. His background is in finance, advising some of the top companies in Switzerland and other places. And the goal really of his investing strategy is to buy and hold. So although he was involved in some development to sell and things like that, most of the deal he's done has been to retain. And his strategy has been to buy at the right price, buy in the right place, and add value. And this is how today, together with his JV partners, he's got a balance sheet approaching 50 million of assets with a very, very low loan to value. So his whole specialty is around de-risking, understanding the analytics and the data. And really, Adam is a reference in terms of property market economics. So if you're not already looking at the Sunday supplement, so Adam published every Sunday quite a piece of content, and it's the only one thing you need to read. Forget the news, forget everything else. If you're in property and you want to be informed about what's happening in the market, Adam's supplement is really the reference. So what can you expect from today's episode? So Adam will go through what's been happening in 2023. What can we expect to 2024? Or can you do more deals, the good deals, the right strategy, and how to the pitfalls really to avoid, going forward. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing about Adam's talk today. So please give a massive Property Filter welcome to Mr. Adam Lawrence.
We can hear the applause, even though we can't hear it. I can hear it really, Guillaume. Thank you. Fantastic. Well, thanks for. I always feel after an intro like that, I'm going to definitely not be able to deliver on anything that's as good as that introduction sounds, but I'll try my best. So. As Guillaume says, I spend quite a bit of my time looking at the markets and the broader bond markets, because that's where the mortgage finance rates are based upon, and that's been extremely volatile and extremely interesting over the last 18 months or so. But also the broader markets in the economy, because I'm interested in things like, are renters going to be able to afford to pay their rent? Is the rental sector getting larger or is it getting smaller? What's the tenant demand looking like? And lots and lots of stuff beyond that. I don't get too obsessed with when recessions might be coming or whatever, because recessions aren't necessarily terrible things for property markets apart from anything else. I wouldn't confuse a recession such as what happened in 2008 to 9, for example, with a typical recession. There was a particular blow up in the credit markets because money was being lent specifically against property very irresponsibly, for example, and that was always going to have some fallout. You had loan to values that were way too high, and you ultimately had people getting loans who couldn't really afford them, could afford them for a couple of years and then weren't going to be able to afford them, and the likes. So all of that also obviously needs bearing in mind. So we all lived through 2023. There's no young babies listening to this call, so we all know what happened, but very, very quick summary. We went into the year with energy prices still a really serious concern because of, apart from anything else, the Russia-Ukraine conflict. That wasn't the only reason why energy prices were moving. They started moving in March, April 2021. Actually, it was another COVID transitory hangover style situation. And most of those things, just to round that off, came about because, apart from anything else, when in 2020, large companies needed to plan for things they might be mining or drilling or producing, they were expecting a huge collapse in demand worldwide because of the pandemic. And ultimately, we know what happened. The government's got out this huge blunderbuss as a general rule of economic stimulus, as we called it, and they fired money, and not just in the way that they fired money since 2009, in terms of quantitative easing. They actually fired money towards the general population for a change. In the US, they directly gave people stimulus checks. In the UK, we had more in terms of loans available, although there were a number of grants, of course, as well for businesses and for small businesses. So we had bounce back loans, and for bigger companies, we had the CBILS, the Coronavirus Business Interruption Loan Scheme, and that put money out there into the market. Now, that should, of course, have been spent on those businesses, keeping those businesses going, paying staff if there was temporarily not enough money to do so, providing cash flow so that furlough payments could be made. But in the real world, I think lots of us know a lot of that money made its way out into the property market, and it made its way into auction rooms and the likes. So therefore, there was lots and lots of money and ability to be able to buy. And of course, the other thing that happened during COVID was interest rates went down even more than they'd gone down before, to the point where the actual cost of money for the banks and the lenders was pretty much zero. So that's where we were at. That changed dramatically, primarily with the disastrous mini budget at the end of September 2022. Liz Truss had been elected leader of the Conservative Party, and that led us into 2023 with a lot of uncertainty. Although she'd already been deposed by then, the bond markets had blown up. Mortgages, they were talking about base rates at 6% and even 7%. There were points where the market thought that that's where we might end up with the base rate. And that could have caused some really serious problems with affordability. As it went along in 2023, the tale of the tape was markets calmed down an awful lot when Jeremy Hunt was elected Chancellor and then Rishi Sunak was elected Prime Minister. Thought that they would be good stewards of the ship. Rates came right back down again. And then what there was really persistent inflation. Inflation refused to go away. It wasn't as people expected, and it was going to be up and down in a very quick sort of volcano-style shape. It's been much more of a longer curve, and it's taken longer than most commentators have predicted to play out. Boring though I am, I started talking about inflation nearly 3 years ago today as one of the symptoms of the pandemic. And for those that, as Guillaume kindly mentioned, my Sunday supplement was warning people about the potential after effects of that. And one of the things that I did in 2022 myself was break a lot of my fixed debt, paid the early repayment charges, and set away new 5-year loans because I was concerned about the risk to the upside. And of course, once the Ukraine situation had happened, bond yields suffered more, and it proved to be quite a good thing. I found out after the event, about 6 months afterwards, that a lot of large companies had also taken extremely long-term loans. Luckily for the large companies, they can go and borrow money for 15 and 20-year fixes quite easily. It's much harder for us to do that in the UK property market. But it took us into 2023 with a market that had absolutely wobbled. A lot of transactions had fallen over. And really, apart from anything else, fear to an extent, because the wider market, when does the market get nervous? When there's uncertainty. And it was much, much more comfortable, although this might sound a bit strange, it was much more comfortable at 5.25% when the conventional wisdom was stating we've probably finished putting the rates up now. Regardless of what the Bank of England would say, most people felt that way. And the bond markets calmed down a lot more than when the base rate might have been at 3.25%, but people were predicting perhaps it would go to 6 or 7%, because those marginal differences would make an awful lot of difference. And the Bank of England did some research on this and found that actually the probable impact to a household would be something to the tune of about £200, £250 a month in terms of the average household with a mortgage. So significant, but not dissimilar to the amount that energy bills were going to go up because of the energy price cap racing up so much. And of course, those bills have come back down since then. So significant, but not terminal, especially as your average household or your median household with a mortgage tends to earn around about 60k. So money they would miss, sure thing. But of course, don't forget that in the background, wages have been going up as well. The labour market's been very tight. We've got around nearly 500,000 people more than we had at the turn of 2020 who are outside of the workforce at the moment. They're of working age, but they're long-term sick. Some of that is just because of the pressure placed on the health service, of course. And that's not a unique phenomenon, although it has come back a bit quicker in a lot of other countries. But we know that our health service is struggling to deal with the backlog. And of course, industrial disputes and action also don't help us get through backlogs. They create more backlogs, of course. So not taking a position on whether the doctors are in the right or the wrong. I'm just here to report the economic facts before you shout at me in the chat. So that's where we got to as we went through 2023. And as that uncertainty started to come back, the bond yield started to come back down and the market started to calm down. Now, you've got to remember, this is property, and I'm reporting every week, every day on my YouTube channel. I'm reporting in real time. I'm not waiting. Whereas the average transaction, according to Rightmove, is now taking 150 days to go through. So that's 5 months. So over the course of those 5 months, you're only seeing in, let's say, June this year, deals that were struck in January this year. So it'll be January's market and January's sentiment that filters through into June's Office for National Statistics figures. Obviously, that doesn't cover every transaction that happens, because if it's an auction transaction, it might be 14 or 28 days, and it's going to be a lot quicker. But of course, that is only a much smaller slice of the property market. I'm talking about 85+% of the market. There are, of course, off-market transactions as well, and things like that. So 2024 feels a lot more optimistic. A lot of the potential problems have been, we've probably butted our head against a couple of significant problems, one of which we did when Liz Truss was the Prime Minister, another of which we did when the 5-year bond yields hit 5% last year, because remember, the banks and the other lenders have got to make a margin. So if we're saying the 5% is the cost in terms of the return you could get if you lent the government that money, well, lenders, of course, need to make a margin on top of that. And you can usually expect between 2 and 2.5% to go on that number. So you're looking at a 7 to 7.5% cost of debt. And for those who've been in property for any length of time, you'll know, even if you're operating HMOs, unless you've got significantly high yield, because of the cost base you've got with paying the bills and all the rest of it, 7% has traditionally, over the last decade or so, been considered a pretty high yield for a buy-to-let style property. So if you're starting at 7.5% cost of debt, there's just no margin there in the first place before you even consider running costs and also all the risks you take as a property investor. So you can see why the investment market really, really fell away. And if you wanted to look to the data for some support of just how much it fell away, the best figures on buy-to-let financing are probably those that are held by UK Finance. The FCA certainly tend to refer to UK Finance data when they look at the situation in the mortgage market. And the FCA data, the UK Finance data, showed that from a historical average of around about 13.5% of all mortgages being used as buy-to-let for investment property, we were down at certain quarters last year, down to under 9% of those mortgages being used for investment property. So 13.5 down to 9. Maybe it doesn't sound like a lot, but if you think about it another way, 9% is 33% lower than 13.5%. So a really significant pullback. And actually, that almost perfectly describes, when you look at the transactions, exactly what played out, because actually cash transactions didn't really calm down much, if at all. They were only 2% lower than they were in 2022. So people who buy without leverage, that might be people who are downsizing, people of a certain age who've paid off their mortgage over a number of years, they would be your most common type of cash buyer. But of course, there are other cash buyers that are out there who are either perhaps running a quick sale kind of outfit where they'll buy your property within 28 days or perhaps even a shorter time frame for a cash price. There's obviously also people who don't use leverage for a variety of religious or other beliefs reasons, and so they only use cash to transact in. So those people, all that whole universe of people, they didn't feel like there was a huge big crash last year or anything to avoid. They carried on transacting as they normally did in 2022. It was very much the price of the mortgage debt that stopped people from buying, and that caused a backlog in the system. So we try and just draw together some of that as to where we therefore got to. We got to a place where ultimately we had higher cost of mortgages, which was putting people off. We had a very, very negative outlook in the media in general. At the start of 2023, we had all sorts of forecasters saying the market was going to drop 8%, 10%, 12%, 15% just in 2023. which I found ridiculous, because if you go back and look at the actual facts, even from the peak to the trough in 2008 to 9, the market as on average only dropped 16.7%. And there were so many reasons why it should drop at that point. For example, loan to values at 95% or above, valuations which were perhaps not carried out as robustly as they might have been, gifted deposits for developers, and I could go on with 100 reasons why that drop is probably an overestimate of what a really bad year in the property market looks like. So I was stunned when commentators were saying we might see a 15% drop. And I came to the conclusion, actually, as the year went on, that the big problem was something that I heard actually quite early on in the pandemic, and that was people didn't understand inflation anymore. And that might sound a bit silly, but the last serious bout of inflation that the UK dealt with was in the early 1990s. And so there is some logic behind that, because nobody really who's left in a senior position in a meaningful organisation such as the Bank of England or such as a large lender or anything like that was probably even working, and certainly not with a real understanding of inflation when we went through that bout in the early 1990s. And since then, we've had some significant differences as well. One of them being the central bank, the Bank of England, was made independent. So it wasn't controlled by the government anymore. You might remember, or you might have lived through those stories of the 15% hike in base rates, which sent mortgage rates to 18%. What sometimes is forgotten at the end of that story is that they realised the 15% would bankrupt too many people who owned homes, because a lot of people had variable rate mortgages at the time, apart from anything else. They cut them to 12% by the end of the day, and actually within a week, the base rate was back down to 8.875%. That still sounds horrifically high by today's standards, but we'd have to remember that wasn't outrageously high by 1980s and 1990s standards. And of course, previous to that, we dealt with inflation well into the 20% and sometimes more in some years in the 1970s. So inflation had been and was a much more serious concern and consideration, whereas the understanding of how to really deal with it had gone away largely. And this is why people couldn't understand that prices had gone up between 20 and 25%, so 30% in some parts of the UK since the beginning of 2020, thanks to all of that stimulus that I talked about and thanks to those ultra low rates. But of course, if by the end of 2023, inflation had caught up to the tune of around about 22 or 23% over that time frame, well, of course, if that's the case, then the 25% or 20% on average that UK property has gone up, all of that's been swallowed by inflation. You know, the average person is getting paid, or certainly will be by April or May this year, 25% more than they were in 2020. You've got to get your head around that. And because the constant messaging from all of the papers and the commentators is about nominal prices, really what we should be looking at is, are we better off? And can we do more with the money or less with the money today than we otherwise did? And there's one more thing that I'd like to raise on that point as well. What's often forgotten as well is that the best data that we have says that around about 45% of property owners, of landlords, of second home users in the UK have leverage, have a buy-to-let mortgage against that property. 55% don't. They're unencumbered. They own them in cash. That's an incredible statistic to get your head around. But what it means is more than half of the market has not had to raise rents aggressively over the last 12 months. Now, they might have used the backdrop as a commercial reason to raise rents, and they run businesses, so you can't really blame them, but they haven't necessarily needed to because of the cost of the debt. It's the 45%, which I dare say will represent a lot of the people on this call, and it certainly represents me, who do use leverage, who've needed to consider a massive increase, perhaps 70, 80, 90% increase in the cost of debt. Now, if you're like me and you fixed a lot of debt in 2022, you also were protected from that. But it's one thing to set aside the businesses that we had before the pandemic or before the rates were going up, and it's another thing to consider, and that's why we use tools like Property Filter, how we go forward with doing new deals, because we were appraising lots and lots of stock, as we do on a daily basis, and finding that with our expectations of rates being at maybe 7.5% that we would have to pay, that either the price we had to pay was so much lower than we'd ever been considering in the past, or that property simply couldn't stack up as an investment proposition. So our offers were getting lower and lower, and therefore you can imagine the success rate we were having, which already is not very high, because that's the nature of the beast. If you have too much success with your offers, you're probably paying too much. You do need to bear that in mind. Those success rates were going down and down, and so our volume started to taper off. Luckily, that time where we were reasonably predicting interest rates of sort of 7.5% had come right back. And now today you have got lenders who will lend at around about 5.7% to a 5-year fixed limited company with no fees attached to it. 5.3% if you're lucky enough to have stock in your personal name. I say that in quote marks because, of course, Section 24 in the taxation, and probably just make a brief reference to Section 24 for people who remember when George Osborne implemented the tax in 2015. He gave a 4-year period for that tax to come in. So for those who don't know, it's the tax that effectively takes account of all of your costs apart from your mortgage income, and then gives you a 20% tax credit against that income. So it might make you a higher rate or even a higher additional rate taxpayer when you really shouldn't be one. And then instead of 40 or 45% relief, you would only get 20% relief. And the reason why he tapered it in over 4 years is, apart from anything else, because he didn't want to disrupt the sector too badly by making this change. But in reality, when the interest rates were very, very low, it was definitely something for landlords to moan about. But in reality, they were paying 0.5%, which was the base rate at the time, plus perhaps around about a 2% margin. The average one tends to vary between about 1.7 and about 2.2 over the base rate. So whilst it was an annoyance, they had an extremely low cost of debt to consider. And where we went from is from a point in until very, very late 2021. It was December 21 when the rates were first put up from 0.1. If you were on, let's keep the maths easy and say you were on a base plus 2% tracker, you went from 2.1% all the way up to 7.25%. And remember, these are interest-only products. So your mortgage costs trebled, or more than trebled, but not times by about 3.5. But not only that, suddenly also the tax relief side of it really came to the fore. So you didn't have George Osborne's 4-year period to kind of feel your way through it. You actually had, in reality, around about 20 months between December 21 and September and August 23, when the rates reached 5.25. So that was always going to have a significant impact on the sector. And you will hear that the clamours for the withdrawal of Section 24 have gone up massively. Lots of landlords have admitted publicly, and a few more admitted to me privately, they are losing money at the moment with the rates where they are, and they have to decide what to do. And this isn't people who are leveraged to a ridiculous proportion. They might be leveraged to even as low as 35, 40%, but they're feeling the pain because if your mortgage costs have gone up 250, 350% in that interim period, of course, that's going to impact the cash flow that you've got and may well send you to a point where you're making a loss, even at a low loan to value on a property every month, before you consider the tax element, which is just one more kick in the guts. So you can see why the investment market, there you go, Francis is just saying in the chat, 400 to 1860, that's more than 4 times the cost. So, I mean, absolutely insane. And of course, similarly, there will be people who are not on pre-2008 base rate tracker mortgages, but they will have dropped off a mortgage rate in the interim. Perhaps they weren't reading the Sunday supplement and they didn't refix their debt in early 2022, and they've gone onto a bank variable rate. The big banks actually track, or the FCA, the Bank of England tracks the average rate that you drop off onto. It's called the BBA rate, and that was announced this morning for December at 7.96%, which was down from 8.03%. And it's actually the first time that rate has started to come back down again. And Francis raised another good point in the chat there. The only ways to consider how to get through that, if you have got significant loan to value and therefore cash flow problems, are either HMO, because you need to sweat the asset harder, you need to work the asset harder. Serviced accommodation, for the same reason, you need to work that asset harder, but also serviced accommodation has the benefit of you being able to switch away from Section 24. because it's the withdrawal of the interest against assured short-hold tenancies. Sorry, it's not the interest itself, it's the type of property that the use class of the property. So if you've switched to serviced accommodation, you can claim your full mortgage interest relief, and that also makes a difference. But of course, that extra cash flow that it should be generating, and I say should because I don't want to make it sound like it's easy to run serviced accommodation short-term rentals. It's definitely not. It's quite hard work to do it well, but it definitely can be done and can squeeze more money out of a property asset if you're in need. So 2 good reasons there to talk about serviced. So thank you for that, Guillaume. So there are lots of things to think about. There's lots of things going on in the chat, which I'm going to try and ignore for the moment. So we're thinking about how we're going to do deals coming into 2024 and what sort of deals are going to be available. So there's a ton of tools on Property Filter, as I'm sure you've seen if you're on this call. If you haven't, highly recommend you having a look and having a demo. The stuff to help people out is very user friendly and the support is fantastic. But really, what are we going to be looking for? We may well be finding lots of landlords who are suffering because regardless of whether the bond yields market has calmed down or not, if you're on a base rate tracker, you're still paying that 7.25%. And although the market at one point at the end of 2023 thought we might have 6 base rate cuts in 2024, I think that's extremely hopeful. And I think we're looking at more like 2 or 3 cuts probably by the end of the year. And actually the market has adjusted a little bit since then, because apart from anything else, there are signs that the UK economy isn't doing as badly as everybody expected. So perversely, as long as this goes on, if the economy is doing okay, unfortunately, that means the interest rate can stay high, and the interest rate needs to stay high in order to try and cool the economy down, because cooling the economy down will cool inflation down, apart from anything else. And that's certainly the way the central bankers see it. There are alternative ways to interpret economics and the economy, but I'm more reporting on the way that the Bank of England and their more traditional economists tend to look at the world, although they don't all agree by any stretch of the imagination. And some of them wanted to put the rate up at the last meeting to 5.5%. The first thing we need to happen is for those people to calm down and accept that we're probably at the peak, and then we can start to look at coming down a little more. I'm not sure about high rates fueling high inflation, because if you looked at what happened in the central bank in Turkey last year, Francis, you'd see a pretty bad example where they put interest rates down and inflation went through the roof further. So there are examples of both, but generally speaking, conventional wisdom is higher rates mean less borrowing, because apart from anything else, if there's less borrowing, then there's less economic activity. Firms have to use their own cash rather than using the bank's cash, and that means they're less likely to make investments. It also means if I've got to borrow the money at 5.25%, then let's remember I've got to get a return of at least 5.25, but realistically at least 7.5% or 10% to make it worthwhile me taking that risk. If I don't, then as a company or as an individual, I probably won't make that move. So property does work differently, because apart from anything else, one of the underreported things for 2023 was how many first-time buyers as a percentage of all of the buyers in the property market there were. There was a record number as a percentage of first-time buyers, which you would think would be seen as a real positive. But you might interpret that another way and say, well, hold on, we've already said the investors took cover, right? They ran for cover. So it wasn't going to be those people. The second steppers, well, the downsizers, the second steppers were probably a little bit trapped because they had an existing mortgage that was almost certainly fixed at a lower rate. Now, of course, some of those mortgages are portable, although I wouldn't suggest there's perfect information that for everybody who's got a mortgage, they might not even know their mortgage is portable apart from anything else, but it might be portable. So that would have still allowed them to move perhaps, but a lot of them aren't portable. And if they're not portable, they'd have rather stayed put on their lower rate, especially if they thought maybe prices were adjusting. So who does that leave? Well, it leaves the really motivated people in the market, because we should never forget just how useful property is, how much utility it has. Everybody needs a roof over their head. And that's one of the central points that got me into property in the first place. It's always going to be needed. And of course, the fact that even back in 2012, when I got started seriously, there weren't enough houses then, and there weren't enough houses being built back then. And guess what? 12 years later, none of that has been solved in any way, shape, or form. In fact, the problems have got worse. And in fact, one more thing to add to that, recent figures around net migration into the UK have shown nearly 1.3 million net people into the UK. It's theorised, I think, perfectly reasonably, that around 90% of those people are likely to go straight into the rental sector. And guess what? There aren't anything like 1.3 million units, or even the average rental household for a migrant is 1.25 people. So you theoretically only need about 1.15 million rental units, but the highest number of voids we've had in the past 15 years is around about 500,000 on the best data that we've got. So even if we took a couple of 100,000 voids out of that pool of potential rental properties, I think you've got to run with a certain number of voids, just like you've got to run in an economy with a certain amount of unemployment, because some people will be moving, some people will be getting married and relocating, some people will be immigrating, etc., etc. So that's a huge amount of demand side pressure that's put on the rental sector. And I don't believe that demand has either been soaked up completely by the rental sector. I think there's a lot of people who are sofa surfing, staying with friends, family, people who initially joined the UK from the same country that they've come from. There's also an awful lot of increase in temporary accommodation, which has been, again, the stats on that are reported quite late, quite slowly by the government, but the last report was around about 30% increase year on year in temporary accommodation. So that's people who, we shouldn't confuse that with homelessness per se, or we shouldn't confuse homelessness with rough sleepers, because there is a big difference. This is people without a permanent residence, so without a tenancy agreement, if that was how you were going to classify them, and certainly without a property of their own that they own. So hundreds of thousands of people there that are somewhere in the system over occupying properties, most likely, whether that be in the rental sector or in the owner occupier sector, or stuck in temporary accommodation and looking for a tenancy, their first tenancy, in order to go forward from there and perhaps get themselves on the property ladder at some point in the future. So when you put all of that together, you know there's gigantic rental demand. If you haven't been living under a rock, you'll know that rental sector prices, depending on which of the indices you look at, are up massively. Again, we're back to that kind of magic number of where inflation is, around between 22 and 25%. That's how much rents have moved upwards. It tends to have been manifested as new rents, because lots of landlords don't like to put the rent up during a tenancy. They're worried about rocking the boat. They're worried about putting more financial pressure on their tenants. And although no one at Shelter would ever accept this, generally speaking, they're human beings who don't want to, supernormally profit off other human beings who perhaps have less than they do. So they tend to keep rents the same. Unfortunately, that isn't necessarily a very good tactic commercially. And what that means is, apart from anything else, you see these stories, like there's been one this week where a landlord who kept the rent the same for 17 years had then had to move the rent upwards, and the tenant is 97, got a daughter living with her who's a carer, and there's a lot of negativity around the landlord putting that rent up, whereas in reality, had he nudged the rent up £10 a year or something similar during the course of the tenancy, it would have built that understanding that rents are going to go up over time, things do inflate, costs do increase. Even if we ignored the interest rates debate, I'm sure everyone would join me in admitting that it costs more to have a boiler replaced than it did 3 years ago. Once again, at least 25% more expensive than it was. And if you haven't had one done yet in 2024, look forward to higher boiler prices because of the heat levy that's being applied to try and dissuade people from selling boilers. Another ridiculous government policy, but there we go. But nonetheless, we were talking about rental demand. Rental demand is huge, and it's going to be huge for years and years to come. Even if net migration was to come down significantly this year, you're talking probably still in the tune of 400,000 or 500,000 people coming into the UK, apart from anything else, to fill the job vacancies, which have been absolutely at a record level since the pandemic. So there's a big disconnect there between what's said in Parliament and the reality of the immigration situation. But it fuels more and more demand, apart from anything else. And so you can be fairly assured if you've got a reasonable product, then on the rental market, it is going to let with some relative ease. So what should you be looking for? I would contend landlords who are portfolio landlords who've had properties for many years, who are stuck on these high mortgages. They might well be interested in some kind of deal. It might look like an option, although the option might not work at the moment because the cash flow is so poor. But again, you've got to get into the figures in individual circumstances. You're going to be looking for tired stock from landlords who don't want to pump money back into it. They've had enough. They want to sell up. You know, just because they're on a 7.25, or they might be on one of these variable mortgages that's more like 10% at the moment, you won't be when it comes to the end of that process. So I've preferred to buy either cash or with bridging over the last number of years and then refinance the property following the BRRR strategy. And Property Filter's got plugins for you to look at specifically properties that might work for BRRR. One of the great things about BRRR, and one of the things that Property Filter can help you with, is it can look for properties that are, I would say, evergreen strategies like this. So how about a property that's a 2-bedroom property which is big enough to be converted into a 3-bed? You know, that's as old as the hills, that idea, but it works. It works really well. It's going to push the rental value up, and it's going to push the capital value up as well. So even if you haven't got an incredible deal in the first place, you can still add value quite considerably by doing something like that. It's not going to cost you a huge amount of money. You may well find that the bedroom is worth £25,000 to £50,000, depending on where in the UK you are, and it may be cost you between £5,000 and £10,000 to create that bedroom. That can be an incredible value adder and really makes a deal sing. So that's the sort of thing you might be looking at. You're going to be looking at properties that have got mortgages, almost certainly. And of course, in any environment, we're looking for motivated sellers, but we would expect there are more sellers at the moment who are motivated because of the debt. So we always talk about it in the realms of the 3Ds: death, debt, and divorce. Now, obviously, you know, we've just had Divorce Day. I think it was yesterday. The first working Monday in January is known as the day when all the divorce papers land on the family lawyers' desks and all the rest of it. So there will be a significant amount of that around at the moment. And unfortunately as well, you tend to see a spike in probate at this time of year simply because of cold weather other than anything else. So that's where the deaths kick in. Oh, and Guillaume's correcting me. He's got a 4th D in there. Defects, yes, absolutely. And that can be handled. That can be handled legally, or that can be handled with building works, or both, which can be another really good way. But the debt pressure from being almost nowhere, remember, in 2020, 2021, we've dealt with various repossession moratoriums or holidays over the past several years. Thanks to COVID, again, the government intervened to say repossessions can't take place. There's a 12-month moratorium. With those moratoriums dropping off, and different governments in different parts of the UK have handled that in a slightly different way, in the same way they've handled rent increases in a slightly different way. But now they're having to taper away from these situations. And of course, a bit like you'll know what's the biggest problem, or what's the biggest mistake people normally face when they start to get into debt. They bury their head in the sands, they carry on, they ignore what's going on, they don't take the action they might need to in order to fix their problems, and instead they just end up further into debt. And we're getting to a point now where that activity is going to be putting people under pressure. We know from the data that arrears have been moving upwards for the past 12 months. Perhaps that's no surprise, but it tends to take 12 to 18 months for these situations to play out. So I would expect there'll be a large number of properties coming to the market that have got debt pressure against them. And what do vendors value in those circumstances? They value speed and they value certainty, right? And if you can provide both, then you're probably doing a lot better job than 99% of the competition. But it might well be that one of those is enough. So as long as you can provide speed, or even if you can provide certainty, you need a few months to resolve a situation. Let's say, going back to Guillaume's point about defects, let's say there's a defect that you might want to solve before you're the legal owner of the property. You might be looking at an exchange with a delayed completion. You might be looking at using an option agreement. As I said, if I'm going to be pumping serious money into a property, I always prefer to have more control over it and would prefer to exchange, even if I was going to sell it on afterwards. That's my personal preference. I'm quite a risk-averse individual apart from anything else. But that's what you might be looking at. So then the second point I was going to make was around doing more deals at the same time. How are you going to be able to do that? Because this is the one thing that stops people scaling in their property businesses. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how I've solved that problem over the years. First of all, sounds really obvious, but I've made sure I do really good deals because it provides more margin. What do I do with that margin? It means I've got money to be able to bring other people into the deal in order to sort the problems out for you. You can gain a huge edge in property, and you would have an edge over me on an individual property level if you were a builder and you were also a manager of those properties. It's going to save you costs. I run up costs in those departments. I am, profit margins for builders who do work for us, and ultimately management costs, which are not, the management is not undertaken by me. A lot of it's undertaken by a company that I control, but nonetheless, there's other people working in that company, which means that there are costs involved, of course. So I have to protect my margin by doing better deals in the first place, right? And that enables you to bring in your first person into your property setup. So that might be still a contractor, it might be an agent or someone like that. But if you're spending, and this happened to me nearly probably 10 years ago now, I started spending more and more time every week on property management because I was doing it myself. And then I suddenly realized it was swallowing up 30 to 40% of my time. And what that meant was I couldn't go out and do deals, even though I had business partners with money who were pressuring me to transact, who wanted to transact on deals. I didn't have the time for the high value work, and I was spending it on the lower value work. So a lot of people have issues with trusting agents, and I do understand that. All I would say is put as much research into choosing the right agent as you would do in choosing the right partner in life, or as in choosing the right property to buy. Treat it as a serious undertaking. I like to work with independent agents who are motivated, who I think are honest, who are also recommended by other people. Corporate agents tend to try and use the business model to just skim profits off for them, which is diametrically opposed to you as the landlord and the asset owner who wants to try and make some money, which would seem fair enough to me. So do consider that as one way. Make sure you've built enough margin into the deals such that you can afford it if you're bringing other people into the equation. When you've got a lot on the go, you can afford to have people like project managers on your payroll, for example, or to have a build team that you employ. It's not a route that I've gone down myself, direct employment of a build team. We've preferred to have relationships with regular contractors who we know we can rely on and call upon, depending on where in the country that we're operating, but it's definitely an option. And if you are a builder and that's where your edge comes from, what you need to think of is, where do you get your first working foreman from who can effectively replace you when you're on site, so that you don't need to be on site, so that you can spend time pumping that time into looking for better deals. Because one thing I know with Property Filter or any other tool, or just going on Rightmove yourself, although I think you'd be crazy to do that these days, but let's say you do, then if you don't have the time, it's time, commitment, and it's following up. You have to follow up with offers that you've made. Remember, even in good times, a third of all property deals fall out of bed. So if you follow that logic through, 1 in 9 will fall through twice if they stay on the market, because it's 1/3 times 1/3 is 1/9. That's 11% of all the sales agreed in the UK. Now, just imagine, that's over 100,000 properties every year that are going to fall through twice. And again, Property Filter has got the tools to help you narrow down, so you're looking for properties that have at least fallen through once, and perhaps you're combining some of the tools that are in there as well to try and find yourself a little bit of an edge. So you need to build the relationships with those agents, book those viewings, and you need to follow up. Those are the absolute keys to the safe. I personally believe, and this really is the case for any business, but certainly in trying to build a property portfolio, you should be prospecting 12 months of the year. A bit like if you're running a growing company, you're probably recruiting 12 months of the year. Now, you're either doing that because you realize that you are, because you're constantly expanding and you need more people, or you're doing it subconsciously because you're having conversations with people who maybe might join the business in the near future, as and when the business is big enough to be able to afford new hires. Building a portfolio is exactly the same. You should always be prospecting, because apart from anything else, if you think, well, the thing is, I've only got money for one property, well, I'd change your mindset and think about what you need to do. If another one comes along, do you need to raise finance Do you need to look at potential JV partners? Can you source that property on? Obviously, you need to be concerned with specific compliance, and not everybody can just do it and up and create a sourcing company. And I'm not advocating that, to be clear, but it might be well worthwhile. If you find you've got a particular knack for finding deals, then perhaps your time is best spent finding deals, because it's some of the highest value work that you will ever do. And I can certainly say from my own experience, we've paid sourcing fees in the past up to £50,000 for a property. And you know what? I've paid those fees with a smile on my face, because there's been a considerable amount more than £50,000 of profit in those deals for myself and my business partners. And we never would have seen that deal if someone hadn't put it right in front of our face. So sourcing fees can be quite considerable if you put some time and effort into it as well. And again, Property Filter can be incredibly useful for you in saving you time if you want to spend some time as a property sourcer, which I'd certainly consider. What I would do is not get bogged down with trying to do everything. That's what I wouldn't do. I would certainly focus on what you're doing, but hopefully that's a good reason to be prospecting for deals all of the time. And then as and when you do grow, and you know, this is often said, people ask the question, you know, what comes first, the deals or the money? For my money, there's absolutely no doubt that the deals come first, because if the deal is good enough, you will be able to find the money. But again, you need to be putting some time and effort into building a network of people who might be interested in investing in you, with you, providing you with secured or unsecured debt. You need to be putting time and effort into building those relationships as well. It needs to be part of your plan. But if you can do that, then you'll find that you'll find that you will never have too many deals. I've never known someone in the property game say, I've just got too many deals and it's a real problem. You can always get rid of them one way or another. So, and what you often find out is, what we found over the years is, we might be in situations such as we were last year where we're offering particularly low, but we might also have a sourcing client, because we do some sourcing as well. We might have a sourcing client who's in a different position. They've got some money, they want to deploy that money. Therefore, actually for them, a 10% discount is good enough. A 10% discount is better than what they can find if they're just using Rightmove themselves or whatever. Whereas we might be looking for a 25 or 30% discount, which is going to be a lot harder to achieve. But it would be silly to discard that lead and not monetize it in any way, shape or form, when we can create a win-win situation for a third party, for a sourcing client. So that's absolutely what we'll look at. And those were the big things that I wanted to share on the deals front for this month's call. I think there was a third point that we wanted to make as well. I'm just having a quick squeeze at what it was. Oh yeah, doing better deals. So better doesn't necessarily mean cheaper, right? It might mean, because there are a lot of traps, and there's a good post about this on social media early today. There are a lot of traps in property. You can just be trapped into thinking, right, I must, especially in times where the interest rate's so high, you go, right, I must go to an area where there's incredible yield. There's an incredible amount of yield in this area. Great. That's gross yield, right? What about operating costs? There is no point having an HMO that brings in £2,000 a month if, when you do a bit of digging, you find out it's got 6 rooms who are paying £333 each per month, and the bills are £500 a month, and the management is this, and the turnover is huge, and the arrears are a problem because the area is a particularly low value area. That is something that looks good on paper, but as soon as you scratch the surface, it's not so good. So you need to do deals that are suitable for you. There is nothing wrong with, if you're a high earner and you're able to put some money aside every month, and then you're able to buy a property, I would still highly recommend you try and follow some kind of momentum or BRRR strategy, because you can run out of money very quickly. But you don't need to sit and wait, perhaps like I do, for those 25% or 30% discounts to come along, so I can guarantee I can recycle all of my cash apart from anything else. And I will still look at deals where I leave some money in, because I think you do miss out, even with a business running at a certain scale. If you only do deals you're pretty sure you're going to get your money out of. What about if you've got something that's going to cash flow £2,000 a month, but you've got to leave 20 grand behind in that deal? Well, that sounds like an exceptional deal to me, because apart from anything else, I'm going to get my 20 grand back within 10 months. That's a very, very acceptable payback period. And then over time, I'm going to be making a significant amount of cash flow out of that property. So try not to let yourself get trapped into any one particular mindset here. Rules are good and they're good to follow, but it might be worth considering where, for example, if everybody says, I only look at deals with a 10% yield, I'm going to be the first one who wants to look at them with a 9.9% yield, because I'm pretty sure that marginal 0.1% is not going to be a deal breaker, right? So it's using that sort of mentality to think through the sort of deals that you want. You also, if I would contend, don't want to be running serviced accommodation or HMOs, especially if you're trying to do the management yourself, if you've got a busy and demanding job or a business that you need to run, because you haven't got the time to be able to do that. So a lower risk, lower return investment, like a single buy-to-let, might be much more suitable, especially if the thing that you're spending your time doing is earning you lots of cash you can put into the next property anyway. So don't be too scared about leaving a little bit behind. I still think that the discount buying model is so very powerful when you look at the numbers, when you consider it. You know, an extra 5% discount can make a huge difference to a portfolio over 10, 15, 20 years or beyond that, which is the sort of time horizon you should be considering if you're looking at property investment. So I think use the filters within Property Filter, come up with some of your own rules as to what a good deal looks like for you. Shut off the social media and the noise about what anybody else is doing, because they're their deals, they're not your deals. And of course, they always look better on social media than they do in real life anyway. We all know that, right? There's often a few critical points left out about that deal. And if you've got to spend 2 years in planning and 12 months in delivering a development, you're going to need to get a huge return on something like that, because it's going to captivate your attention for 2 or 3 years. And when you look at this is why I look at IRR when I look at returns, the internal rate of return, because I want to know how much time I've spent. But even IRR is not perfect, because it doesn't tell me how much effort I've put in to deliver that deal. And if you want to deliver more and you want to do better deals, then ideally motivated sellers who don't need a massive amount of work doing to their property, or perhaps you've got a good end client who's a social housing provider, if that's a particular strategy you want to look at. How can you help a good, with a strong balance sheet registered provider? How can you help them in order to fulfill their housing requirement? Perhaps they can pay you more money. Perhaps it can be guaranteed rent. Perhaps it can be on a long lease. All of these are things that could add serious value at the back end. So it doesn't just have to be necessarily the defect category, as Guillaume called it. It doesn't have to be a refurb. It doesn't have to be a legal title problem. It doesn't have to be any of that. You might just be happy with a small discount, but you're going to get a great deal on the back end. Perhaps you've got a great rent-to-rent HMO operator you can work with. These people are out there and they do exist. Just remember to do your due diligence, which includes looking how long they've been trading. Ideally, speak to some of their other clients as well and consider that. But you can add value with the type of tenancy you've got. That's very much a commercial property type of mindset, and it's well worth considering. You might be willing to take a lower rent with, I love that one, BRRR. Doesn't quite trip off the tongue so well, does it, Guillaume? But buy, don't refurb, refinance, for anyone who didn't see it. But absolutely, they can be fantastic. And you know, we've done that a whole number of times where all we've had to do is wait out the 6 months between completion and then a lender being willing to give a full market valuation. There are more lenders in the market these days who will offer an open market valuation, and you not have to wait for the 6 months, but you've still got to get a RICS surveyor on board with that, even if the lender and the business development manager is telling you that's going to happen. So you normally have to price in that 6 month period, but you can get significant uplifts if they accept there's a good reason why you've done that deal. Ideally, you can at least add some cosmetic value as well. And that depends on how you sourced the property in the first place, whether it was already on the market or whether it was an off-market kind of thing. I guess we probably better go into Q&A now, Guillaume, because I don't know how much longer we've got, but hopefully I can get a couple of questions answered as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Adam. Thanks so much for plugging Property Filter as well. That's much appreciated. I know you like it. So yeah, so how to do deals this year, tired stock, BRR, different ways of adding deals from your evergreen 2 to 3 bed all the way to just the paperwork and commercial asset management what you just covered. Look for motivated sellers. And as you said, you know, this is the whole idea of Property Filter. Property Filter is here to give you an unlimited deal flow of motivated sellers. So when the sales fallen through, when it's been listed with multiple agents, when it's been a combination of this and been reused 3 times, etc., negative equity. So all of these score the leads in Property Filter, so you can go straight to these. So that's absolutely bang on. And then how do you do multiple deals? Buy the great deals. Like sometimes it's as simple as that. Buy them with margin, so you got enough margin to do things, and then be prospecting for deals 20 months a year, so 12 months a year. Sorry, follow up. So I really like how we resonate in the Property Filter methodology and the way you look at this thing. So that's really cool, and thank you very much. So do we have some questions in the chat for Adam whilst we're here? I think we were all a bit blown away by a lot of the information for the start of the year. I was really happy to see that it's not all doom and gloom, and you don't have to listen to the news, watch the TV, and then think that it's all going to fall apart. Property is still a universal need. Everybody needs a house to stay and live. So it's got long years in front of them before we all move to the metaverse, but I think we always need some place to stay and live. So yeah, I'm going to have a look in the chat for some of you guys' questions. So this is your time to get a bit of access to Adam, and then if you need to, Adam, did you want to talk about, whilst we wait for some questions, do you want to talk about? So I know you and Rob are running some workshops as well, and it's worth maybe people might want to be aware about it, and you want to talk a little bit about that?
That's great, Guillaume. Thank you very much, for the chance to talk about this. So on Thursday, the 25th of January, we are running a workshop. It's in London, in St. Catherine Docks at the Dickens Inn. We will be talking about all sorts of stuff you need to be considering for 2024, and it's an opportunity for us to go into a lot more detail about how we run our property businesses day to day, how we manage our own selves and our time and our productivity, and all the things that will be useful for having a much more powerful 2024, basically. So I'll pop a link in the chat if that's okay, and when we finish the Q&A, and we can
pop it now so people can have a look,
okay.
And then we can have a look at and then we can go through Q&As, because I think when you talk to me about these, when we talked about your plans of supporting people, etc., there's lots of things we talked about today that might sound a bit overwhelming, and then people might need to spend a bit of time with you for the implementation. So it's I think that's quite interesting. So it's worth people being aware of it. Okay, so in terms of the questions, so got Alex saying really good content, Adam, thank you. Charlotte messaged me and say, is there a specific training on the paperwork exercise or to add value with basically asset management, increasing lease, changing the type of tenants? And I'm guessing this is the kind of stuff you help people with as well, Adam, is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's right. We do. So there's not I couldn't give you a manual of one size fits all, because apart from anything else, there are so many different things that come up. And, I still see, at least once a month, I'll see something on a land registry title that gets put in front of me that I've not seen before. And I think if a partner at a law firm who's done it for 30 years would probably tell you the same thing, to be honest. So there isn't necessarily a very simple blueprint process to follow, but certainly in terms of the way you have to think through these problems, absolutely.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing the link here. Jessica says the content of the event looks amazing. So yeah, check it out. AJ is asking a very good question. So how would you buy a large, high-value house with land and convince the seller to sell it low?
Yeah, and it's a great question, AJ, because it is hard when you think. My brain tends to think in percentages, because that's how it works with loan to values and all the rest of it. And it's much. And this is one of the reasons why I've tended to concentrate on individual properties worth below 200k, or portfolios of such properties, or blocks of flats, because it's a lot easier for a vendor to swallow 10, 15, 20% off 100 grand is 10, 15, 20 grand. That same percentage off a million is 100,000, 150,000, 200,000. It's a lot harder, but it's also a lot harder to price stuff at the top end. So there's, it's really quite easy to price a 2-bedroom terrace house or a 3-bedroom terrace house or a 3-bedroom semi. You know, there's tons of that sort of stock normally around. You've got that road, you've got the 1/4 mile radius, you've got all the rest of it. When you start getting to higher value stuff and they're detached, they might be quite unique. They might be built at different times. There can be a huge disparity on the same road, and you can see this for yourself if you don't already know by Google Street View, walking down a road that you know that's got expensive value houses on, and just take a close look at how different they can be, and look at how different some of the prices they've traded at on the land reg are. So probably the first blocker you're going to have to overcome is, where did the price come from in the first place for the vendor? Where did the price come from? And some of the logic you're probably going to have to use, if it's been hanging around for a while, if it's sticking a bit, is, well, the thing is, ultimately, the market has seen this and it's not selling. So why is it not selling? You know, we've got to go through that process. We've got to lead the vendor through that process. So they're the ones who end up saying, oh, well, actually, maybe the price isn't too right. Okay, so going back to our logic, where do we get the price from? Have we got to do a large amount of works to the property? Because in this day and age, works are extremely expensive, and you can show some evidence of that with quotes, depending on how far you get down the process. But a friend of mine very recently sold a house that's worth well into the 7 figures, and it had spray foam insulation in the loft that they'd had done. So their mortgage lender didn't actually know that they'd had it done. They had the mortgage. They didn't know what they were doing. They never asked me or anybody else they knew whether it was a good idea. And for those who don't know, spray foam insulation can be a real problem for mortgageability. And even though they had a cash buyer negotiating on the sale of the house, the cash buyer went away, got a quote for a new roof, and expected them to take the whole price of and you can imagine on a 7-figure property, the new roof is not coming in at anything that looks like 10k or anything like that. They negotiated in the end and were willing to share it 50-50, which they thought was reasonable because there was no evidence that the spray foam was going to cause that problem. But those bits of negotiation can be worth so much more money at the top end. But your issues are going to be, there aren't going to be many of them out there on the market that are going to be hanging around. So if you're already starting with a very small amount of properties, before you get the property filters of the world involved, you've got to manage your expectations downwards realistically, AJ. And if you, I mean, I could tell you what I did for my own personal residential home, and that is we found some land and we built it, because that saved us an awful lot of money in stamp duty, and we were able to build exactly what we wanted. So that's probably a bit of a sidestep of the question, but I hope that helps.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Again, good feedback on your workshop, so thanks a lot for that. People are DMing me as well, so I've got a few DMs and a few public questions. So I'll start with Mark. Coming back to the inflation, is the Bank of England responsible for creating this due to the continued quantitative easing well before COVID, and this also continually decreases the value of our money? So I think the question is the Bank of England is the cause and effect of all of that?
Yeah, it's difficult, isn't it? Because really, if we'd taken our medicine after the financial crisis, we'd have had a considerably bigger recession and a bigger contraction than we otherwise did. Quantitative easing probably didn't do what they hoped it would do. And what it really did is it inflated the value of assets and it kept the interest rates low. Now, they were okay with it because we didn't have too much inflation of meaning. We had a point in 2011 where inflation tickled up to just over the 5% mark, but it died away very quickly. And the problem, of course, was we were close to a depression. You might remember we were close to a double dip recession. And so this stimulus was thought to be still needed. If you fast forward to like 2012, probably 13, that probably would have been the first year where there would have been a case for withdrawing some of the QE and starting to put the interest rates back up. They decided not to do that. And I think history's probably been pretty kind to them so far, because I think probably, and I'm a big fan of Mark Carney's, but I think he probably needs to be held to account for not pushing that a bit harder. You might remember he was trying to give a lot of forward guidance. And one of the bits of forward guidance he said was, when unemployment goes down below 6%, we'll consider putting the interest rate back up. And it actually went from 7 to 6 to 5 to 4 to under 4. And that wasn't a reason to put the rates back up. And then, of course, the referendum came in 2016, which caused a big jolt in the markets, which won't have helped as well. But I think history will probably reflect that the interest rate could have come up a bit more, a bit quicker, and that could have been done at with less quantitative easing. I think that is fair to say. But of course, I've got to be reasonable and say it's always easy when you know the answer. For whatever reason, whether there was cronyism involved or not, they decided to keep the interest rates right down there. And of course, it had that impact of it's probably had less impact than people have given it credit for. If you go back to that stat that I cited, 55% of landlords are unencumbered. Also, around 55% of owner occupiers are unencumbered as well. So it tells you just how much stock isn't affected by an increase in the interest rates. And that's a dramatic difference between now and the 1990s, the 1980s, the 1970s. There was much more leverage. Yes, it was at higher rates. Yes, properties were cheaper, but it was at higher rates. It was higher percentages of people's incomes, and it was variable. So people didn't have that level of certainty. So, look, I think the central bank have got to be held accountable. George Osborne gave them a bit of a get out when he was the chancellor, because he said, look, you haven't got to get inflation down to the target straight away when there's inflation, right? And then he didn't really give a time frame over which you could get it down to, as long as there's a plan. So the way the Bank of England interpreted this is, if we produce a forecast that says that within 3 years inflation will come back to 2%, and it's credible and the analysts believe it, then that's okay. And if you look at the last few years, all they've done is continually produce forecasts that show that inflation will come down to 2%, and it hasn't been 2% since, I think, July 2021.
Thanks a lot, Adam, for that. Sabalin's asking, many thanks for the advice. Will you advise when starting out to use holding structures with multiple companies, or just to keep it simple and add as you grow? I can maybe speak for myself. I had really good advice from clever accountants who made me create a really nice complicated structure, which I now call the dog, wagging the tail. And they've been very happily taking £4,000 of fees for me over this time. And the reality is, with hindsight, I would just have kept it simple to one company, and then maybe a separate SPV for my JVs or something like that. But I don't know what you want to add to this.
Yeah, I think probably the answer is, it has to be individual circumstances. And the argument which they used on you, the old start as you mean to go on sort of thing, build it right from the start. Yeah, I do think you need to be cautious with that. It's going to depend on a lot of things. Number one, which lenders are you going to use? Because some lenders will be comfortable with you starting in a simple structure and then rolling it forward into a more complex structure. Some of them won't like it at all, and it would actually breach your mortgage conditions. So you do need to be quite careful about that. Number two, where's the money coming from that you're going to put into the company? Is it coming from JV partners? Is it coming from another trading business that you've got? Is it coming from earned income? Is it coming from all of the other potential sources? Because if it comes from a consultancy business, let's say you're an IT consultant, to pick on someone, right? It might well be favorable for you to have a holding structure and your IT services company, and then a property company over here, because you don't have to take the money out and suffer the personal tax, and you can move it over to the investment company. So if you're a high earner and you're earning quite a lot, you want to invest in property, that's certainly one of those situations where I would explore a relatively simple holding company. But I'd also be finding an accountant that didn't want to charge me £4,000 a year for the privilege of that structure, because in reality, there isn't that much extra work involved, right? There's 3 sets of books, one of which is going to be potentially dormant because it's a holding company holding shares. You've already got to pay for 1 set of books. Therefore, why should it need to be so much more money? So I'm quite keen that people get good value for what they pay for, not just get ensnared by someone who's on the circuit who's telling people they need expensive holding structures when they don't.
Thanks a lot for that. Prashant is asking, what is your view on strategy to use PD for 3-bed houses and change them into 2 flats with 2-bed flats in London, for example?
Yeah, could work. Obviously, consultation period to be considered after that announcement in the autumn statement by Jeremy Hunt. I think there'll be other things to consider. Like, I think there'll be potentially Article 4 directions which remove the PD rights in certain boroughs of London in order to preserve those homes. I don't see how changing the existing planning law and doing it through permitted development will mean that Article 4 can't be used. As I say, obviously still consultation, potentially valuable. I like the idea of looking. I prefer things like looking in existing Article 4 areas and find it. Let's say we're talking about HMO, looking at HMO that was tired and could be revamped and rents could be drastically increased, but they've already got the advantage of being within the Article 4 area. So if you applied that to flats in London, what you might consider instead is looking at buildings where they've been converted illegally and they haven't got certificates of lawfulness and the likes, and going through the certificate of lawfulness process, because a lot of that value will be added. That's that buy, don't refurb, refinance, isn't it? The value is going to be added by sorting the legal side of it out. Bit early to say about the PD for 2 flats, or maybe 3 flats or 4 flats. I mean, it can definitely work in the right properties, but it'll be, I'm sure it'll be speculated along quite heavily. What you're probably looking for are unusual angles that add significant value.
Yeah, I agree. Teams DM'd me, how do you compete with quick sell companies? They're all after 30% discounts. They throw a lot of money at the advertising, and then they tend to make only a 12% margin. And that's the reality. We speak to trading companies who spend 50K a month on pay-per-clicks and things like that. And yes, they'll go and get the 30% these deals, but they have huge costs. And I think your angle here is that there's lots of deals hidden in A side, the needles in the A side that Property Filter finds you. And then you can go after them, get the 20, 25%, and you don't have this base cost, the cost base these companies have. And you can, at your level, do this one deal every few months, and then, get your 3-4 below market value deal, like speaking to the right motivated sellers, structuring the right deal, understanding how to add value, and actually, implementing that. So, Adam, I don't know if you want to add to that.
I don't know, there's too much I can add to that. I think that's a fantastic answer. I know quite a few people who spend that big money on the marketing. Like you say, to do a deal might be costing them 5 or 7K base costs to start with, and they also know every trick in the book. So it's difficult to compete with them. When I do compete with them, because we do a bit of direct to vendor and we do speak to vendors, and when we do compete with them, we're talking. It goes back to what I was saying about speed and certainty, because they might be promising quite a lot, but then they might be offering an option agreement, whereas the vendor doesn't want an option agreement, right? They want a level of certainty. And if we can explain that to the vendor, then they might well go with us. One of the things we'll also educate the vendor on is that a lot of the quick sale companies also, unfortunately, have a tendency to drop their prices at the last minute and try and take advantage of an extremely motivated vendor or a vendor in a bad spot. So we won't do that. That's not within our values. It's not how we do business. And we'll leave the door open to the vendor to say, look, the quick sale company is telling you a bigger number right now, but it's not going to be the number that they're going to pay you. We are going to pay you this number. Consider coming back to us. But this isn't a free bet for the vendor either. If you come back in 28 days and the interest rates have gone up 0.5%, unfortunately, we are going to change our offer. But today, if you accept our offer today, we will honour that price and we will get the deal done very quickly. So looking for something that the quick sale companies can't do. And really, you should have an edge over a quick sale company, because you yourself, talking to a vendor, should have more skill than a quick sale person at the end of the phone who is just the sort of lead generator, first port of call. They shouldn't have the skill level that you do, but it takes time and effort to build these skill levels. There's no two ways about it.
Awesome, thank you. Steven's asking, where have you been, Steven? I think you were here since the start. What's your overall view about the property market in 2024? The general view from the experts, inverted comma, seem to be that supply will continue to outstrip demand. I don't know if you meant this or the opposite. And while interest rates continue to be higher and the masses are holding out for more certainty, there is an opportunity. Is there an opportunity for those that are bold to get all of some good deals?
So my own thoughts are that the interest rate, the base rate will probably be cut 3 to 4 times over the course of this year. And that is because the bank have done their primary job of sorting out this transitory inflation that took a couple of years to pass through. And now they've got to kill off the remainder of the inflation, which is going to come from things like wage price pressures and things like that. We've got some big wage rises planned in 2024, thanks to the wisdom of the Chancellor. So that's going to put upwards pressure on pricing. My own view is 3 to 5% up by the end of the year. That might be a bit bullish. It is going to depend on what happens to the interest rate to a large extent. But I think what people forget is 2020, we did fewer deals than the market would have liked because the market was closed for a few months. 2021, we did more deals because there was a stamp duty holiday, and that ran through into the beginning first half of 2022, when activity then dropped off a cliff very late on in 2022, thanks to Liz Truss. 2023 volumes are right back down. We did about 1 million deals as a nation over the course of the year, 1 million transactions. That's quite low. You know, we'd normally be expecting 1.1 to 1.2 million. I think we'll be back to more like that 1.1 to 1.2 million this year. Market a bit more functional. And I think that apart from anything else, apart from the availability of credit, the next biggest thing that drives house prices is disposable income. And unlike loads of the headlines, actually real household disposable income, so that's how much of households got left after tax is considered, after inflation is considered, RHDI, they call it. RHDI is at a record level in the UK at the moment. And it's going to go up more because the April pay rises are going to come around and people are going to be getting more money either legally or because they're going to be negotiating it. And they're going to want to spend that money on houses that they didn't spend on houses in 2023. So I think your first-time buyers will remain as motivated as they've been, but you're going to get some of these secondary players back to the market who weren't willing to transact at a mortgage rate of 5.5% or 6%, but they are willing to transact at a mortgage rate of 3.95%.
Awesome. Thanks so much. One last question from Michael, who says, I wasn't able to join earlier. Can I get the recording of this, please? So yeah, the recording will be inside your Property Filter success base and available from tomorrow. And so that you can, as part of being a Property Filter member, you get access to the library of these. All right. Thank you very much, everybody. Adam, do you have a closing sentiment for today's call? Closing thoughts?
I think just to say thanks for having me. It's good to talk to everyone. Thanks to everybody for all of their feedback and their questions, because that's what makes it all a rich and worthwhile conversation. And thanks again, Guillaume, and keep doing the good work, mate.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you. Sorry, we overrun a little bit, but it's always great, when we've got great speakers like Adam. So thank you for joining us today on today's Deal Finder Corner. So visit and look at take on Adam's opportunity to go and join him on the workshop. I think the link is in the chat. Visit propertyfilter.co.uk, log on to your Property Filter account, check out the deal blueprint where you can define your goldmine area, engage with motivated sellers, assess properties in seconds, load your pipeline, and as Adam says, follow up, and make deals. Be looking for deals 12 months a year, back the best deals, keep them for yourselves. An endless supply of deals of motivated sellers. I hope you enjoyed today's Deal Finder Corner, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you so much. Thank you, Adam. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Ian. Thanks, Adam.